Hi, thanks for tuning in. Today I'm actually starting a new teaching series called Nurturing Faith in the Wilderness. And so the goal of this series is to try and get us to think about how we can experience life with God and grow faith in God whilst things around us aren't going the way that we'd want them to. I think it's very easy to have faith and express faith when things are just going so well, when we're winning and when the sun is shining, when things in life are predictable and as they should be. I think having big faith then is really quite easy. But what about when things in life are confusing and they're not actually going as you'd planned? Like now, living in the time of a global pandemic, when there's all this disruption around and things like routines in life and systems that we depend on in life, things that we structure life around, they're all falling apart. What about when things that we've just been so familiar with, they're gone? What about when there's dreadful loss and pain? Faith becomes really quite complicated during those times. So how is it that we become the kind of people that can find God and nurture faith in the midst of all these things that we're going through? See, here's the thing. Faith, or the faith that we have, isn't meant to just flourish when things in life make sense. If you read through the Bible, through the book, the story of faith very much flows out of an incredibly painful and confusing circumstances. If you read through all the stories of the Bible, right from beginning to end, many of the key individuals, they find themselves having to sort of go round and round in wilderness situations of some kind in their life. They're put into situations where things are just a complete mess. All the routines of life are thrown up in the air and things just don't seem to make sense, and there's lots of loss and pain and so on. And so that's what faith looks like in the scriptures. And that doesn't really feel good to us, does it? But that's characteristic of the entire story. If you go back to like the likes of Abraham and Moses and through all the prophets of the Old Testament and John the Baptist, Jesus himself, he, of course, right at the beginning of his public ministry, he was out there in the desert, hungry, being tempted, facing difficulties. As you read through the stories, it seems like, God uses these confusing, disruptive, even painful wilderness times to do a work in the hearts of his people that maybe he couldn't do in any other place in life. I think you'd agree that we are really living in crazy times. I've spoken with a number of people who, for some, this pandemic has just been little more than an inconvenience or a disruption. But I've also spoken to many people who have said just how it's impacted all of their life, their family life. It's like, I really love my kids, but having them around me all day is, no way. I think I'd prefer to have my kids in blocks of 2 or 3 hours and no more, Or I love my husband, but he's in my hair like 24/7 and doing my head in. I've spoken to a lot of people too who this whole thing has completely knocked them for six. Their lives have been turned completely upside down. For some, it's created a real sense of disconnectedness, loneliness. Some find themselves in a place of complete despair because of loss of a job or cut back in hours, along with all the security of the income and all that sort of stuff. The fear of losing their home. For some, it has been the horrific loss of a loved one who's died to the virus. And so what happens when we humans go through such disruptive and painful, confusing situations is many of us seek out ways to sort of medicate, to manage the effects of the disruption and the discomfort and the pain. So for some, we hide away in our homemade office space and work extra hours just to get away from the kids. or we try to fill in the gaps that have been generated, but we fill them in with kind of superficial things like binging out on Netflix or other TV entertainment. There's been an increase in the consumption of alcohol that I've been reading about over these last couple of weeks. Also, overeating. I think it was Andrew saying that a work colleague was recounting how her husband has put on 2 stone in weight since the beginning of lockdown. Studies have also shown that visits to pornography websites has gone through the roof since the start of lockdown. It's incredible. I just think how amazing it is how the removal of certain patterns and structures and freedoms in life, they can cause such changes in our behavior as we seek to manage the situation or manage ourselves in the midst of what's going on. So again, the question is how do we find God and how do we nurture faith in this place when things just don't make sense or they are painful or they're confusing? Now, thinking about our current situation, I was also thinking about the people of God in the Old Testament, when they were wandering around in the wilderness. They had been set free from Egypt, which clearly was a good thing, but they'd been sort of drawn out from a life that they had been so familiar with for generations. So think, all the patterns of life and systems and lifestyle and rules. So now they've kind of come out from that. Out of that sort of life, and now they're heading somewhere. I mean, there was a time where they actually came literally up to the doorstep of where God wanted them, the promised land. And so they were on the brink of stepping into this new life, this new destiny, but they were turned away because of their lack of trust in God. And then they ended up spending 4 decades wandering around in the wilderness. But it's right in that place that afforded God the opportunity to actually work something into his people, to give them identity and to fashion them into something that he wanted. But I was thinking about how it's similar for us. We've kind of come from a life with all of its patterns and expectations, all the sort of cultural norms and the familiarities to us, things that we rely on, and we're heading somewhere. But I still think we're in kind of a limbo land sort of place. There is still lots of disruption to things in life, things that we become reliant on or expectant of in life. They're still filled with lots of uncertainty. Some people across the country who have had that sense of being on the brink of stepping into normality again have been turned around and put back into lockdown because of the increased levels of the virus transmission levels again. So, for us, we can kind of look ahead and we might get that sense that the promised land, it's just kind of over there. But we don't know how long it's going to be or, whether we're going to enter into that in any time soon. What if we are thrust back into lockdown measures again tomorrow? So for us, I think we're kind of in that sort of wilderness place. Now, I don't know the answers about when we're going to come out of this and what things will look like. But what I absolutely do know is that where we are is a great place for God to form us and to remake us and to establish our identity in him so that when we do re-enter normal life, we do so change, we do so different. When we're able to come together and actually worship together physically as a church, we'll do so with new power and a new dynamic to our worship and changed hearts, and a real new renewed sort of servitude to God. So for the next few weeks, we're going to actually look through the book of Numbers in the Old Testament. We'll look at how the people of Israel went through their wilderness experience, and in that place, how they got a firmer grip on an understanding of their own identity and who God is and their destiny with him. So I'm going to want to start with showing you a video. I'm going to play you a video. It's a video created by the Bible Project. Some of you will have watched some of their animated videos that they've made and put out that sort of cover many of the books and stories of the scriptures. Now, this one is on the book of Numbers, and it's absolutely brilliant. So I'm just going to play the first few minutes of that, but I think this video will help us to get a real good overview of the book and the story of the people of God and the string of events that God leads them through in their years of wilderness wanderings. So let's take a look at this.
The Book of Numbers gets overlooked, partly because it has a really boring name.
Which is a shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories, but let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
So let's jump into this story. It all begins at the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and we've become really familiar with this mountain.
Yeah, if you remember, Israel came here after Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here, got the 10 Commandments here, built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 full year.
And now they take a census to number the people as they prepare to leave.
Right, and they're given these instructions for how to organize all those people in the camp. God's presence in the tabernacle, and then the tribe of Levi and the priests around it, and then the rest of the tribes around them. And this pattern, it's this visual symbol for how God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people.
And they're told that when the cloud of God's presence moves, they're to pack up and travel with it.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is carried by the Levites out in front, and then the tribe of Judah, and on and on. And this order is also a symbol for how God's holy presence is their leader and guide through the wilderness.
So that's the first section of the Book of Numbers. Such a brilliant video. But we saw there that as I said before, the people of Israel are freed from slavery. And the first thing that happens is they are called on to take a number of censuses. Remember, God's people are constructed up of a number of tribes, a dozen tribes or clans, if you will. And so they are instructed by God to count up who from among those tribes we have among us now, who is with us, if you like. But also during that first section of Numbers, the people are all given all of these instructions on how to structure themselves, how they are to live. So they've just come out of slavery, where for generations they've been told, what they shouldn't do and what they should do and how they should do it. And so if you don't do it that way, then you are severely punished or killed. And they come out of that place, and they've been told what all the rules and all the structures, and now they have nothing. It's like they don't know what to do. They haven't had to make up any of the rules before. So first off, then God is saying to them, look, let me give you some structure here. Let me give you some direction. And so he gives them these instructions on how they are to align themselves and how they are to worship and so on. Now, if you're reading through the Book of Numbers, and I do encourage you to read the book actually over the next few weeks, if you are reading it and you're kind of looking at all of the details, it can be a bit boring, I'll have to admit. Earlier on in the year, the Book of Numbers came up as part of my reading plan, and it took me right the way through the book. And sometimes I was just reading this thing saying to myself, why on earth do I need to know all this detail? But so it can be boring, I admit that. But if you kind of step back and take a more broader look, what's interesting is just how in all the things that they are to do, God has to be at the center of everything. So the image that we just saw there in the video of the tabernacle, which of course is the very presence of God, it's positioned right at the very center of their life and everything that they do. So all of their little patterns and their rhythms of everything that they're doing through day by day, God has to be at the center. Now, this is absolutely crucial to us and to what it is to nurture faith and live life as his people. God has to be at the center of our lives. So it's not a case that what we do is just kind of figure out how we want to live life and how we want to generate the most pleasurable life, and then add God on as a kind of peripheral bolt on and say, God, will you now just bless what I've created? That's not how this is supposed to work. God has to be at the very center of all of our life. So we're learning to trust him with and in everything in life. Now, this is the thing. God doesn't become the center of our life just by us saying that's where we want him to be. We have to actually do something. We have to restructure our lives, reorganize life with the intention of positioning him right at the center. You know, with historians or archaeologists, then they do these sort of site digs and things, don't they? Examine artifacts from thousands of years ago, and in doing so they're able to perform or build a profile on the lives of the people and the culture that they are actually studying through these items. They can see what were their practices and what were things that were important to them, what they worshipped and what was at the center of their lives. I do wonder if in hundreds of years' time or thousands of years' time, if those kind of archaeological type people was to look back and examine our lives, if they, was able to look into our homes and our lives, what would they conclude as being the very thing that is most important to us? I've heard somebody say that if someone was to do that, they would probably deduce that the TV was our object of worship because of its prominent central location in just about every one of our homes. So they'd say, it's absolutely clear that back then in the 21st century, their priority in life was being connected to the world and being entertained through the television set. So the question I want to ask you today and ask myself is, if someone was to examine your life, examine my life, what is it that they would be able to see that would confirm to them that God is at the center of our lives? If someone was to, track your life for a week, have access to your diary and follow you around, you'd probably think they're a bit weird, and I'd agree. But what is it that you don't do or do and do or don't say? What is it that what is your priority, or what is it that you put on display? So it's not necessarily what somebody can hear of you, but what do they see from the outside? What is on display that shows what is important to you? So, what would cause them to actually say, what's absolutely clear to me is that this person, Rob, in Rob's life, I've followed him around. God is clearly the most important person to him, and God is central to his entire life. I guess some of us would probably say, well, I go to church every week. That shows a priority, doesn't it? People see that, and that's my priority. But what about when the ability of us to physically get together as the church on Sundays is taken away from us? What then? Is there anything else from within your week that you are giving yourself to, or living into, something that is beyond the obligatory or expected tradition of the Christian life. I guess you're probably gathering that I'm kind of leading our thinking towards the whole area of spiritual practices or spiritual disciplines. You know, with the people of God right there in the wilderness, God prescribes to his people a series of patterns or rhythms or practices or feasts, which would later on from, the kings and the prophets and the people of influence that sort of emerged from the people later on, that these practices that they'd formed in the desert, in their lives, it would just go on and shape who they would become later on in life. I for us, this isn't, difficult. Maybe it's just a case of us sitting down and saying, do you know what? I think I really need to create some kind of consistent pattern of prayer in my life. I really need to do that. Or I really need to build in some kind of structured plan or approach to reading the scriptures. Or I really need to plan out practicing the Sabbath. Maybe it's, I just really need to commit my life to practicing solitude and silence. Just getting before God in the silence before him and being with him. During this time that we haven't been able to gather together as a church, maybe this really is the time where we can grow and develop our own patterns, our preferred patterns of getting connected to God, so that when we eventually do come back together again, our gatherings and our worship will be just so much more empowered, so much more real and dynamic because of what God has formed in us during this time. Some of us need to actually make some more practical preparations in this. So there was some years ago we were talking about all this kind of soul care stuff with our leaders in the church, and we were saying back then that sometimes that we have to go as far as getting things scheduled down into our diary for there to be more of a chance of it actually getting done. And so I guess I encourage you to do that. Sketch out a plan in your diary on having a Sabbath, setting aside that day of resting and reconnecting with your family and with God, learning again how to rest. So schedule in that time, schedule in some time so that you can kind of set aside prioritize a time of prayer or a time of reading the scriptures. Now, this isn't a legalistic thing. Maybe you've heard us talking about spiritual practices before, and maybe what's going through your mind is, man, this is just like religious stuff, Rob. It's like religion, isn't it? Or maybe you're just one that thinks, Rob, I'm just not really into all of that sort of habitual, repetitive, ritualistic stuff. I just want to live and respond to God's promptings in a more sort of dynamic sort of way, just those powerful, impromptu leadings of the Spirit where I get to do something with God. It was just unplanned, those sorts of things. Now, what's really interesting about what we read in the book of Numbers and with God's people is that the structures and the patterns that God builds into the lives of the Israelites in the wilderness, it actually enables the people to hear and discern God's voice and his leading so that they can spontaneously respond to his leading them and what he's calling them to do. Check out what it says here in Numbers 9, verses 22 to 23. It says, whether the cloud stayed over the tabernacle for 2 days, or a month, or a year, the Israelites would remain in camp and not set out. But if it lifted, they would set out. At the Lord's command they encamped, and at the Lord's command they set out. They obeyed the Lord's order in accordance with his command through Moses. The instructions and the structures that God gave to the people, it wasn't just simply to make them like a nation of subservient robots or something. It was to enable them to be able to hear his voice and respond to God in their lives. So if those of you out there and you're kind of thinking to yourself, or you're at least you're kind of kicking back against structure, you feel that resist inside against structures and practices whilst desiring, I just want the spontaneity with God. I'd say without the structure, I don't think we will be able to see what God is actually doing in order to spontaneously respond to him. You see, it's through our week, it's during those devotional times, it's in the personal prayer times, it's in the reading of the scriptures, it's where this is where we develop the skills of hearing and discerning his voice. And so then, as I say, when we do come back together, we'll be much more stronger. We're going to be so much more in tune with the things of God. We're going to be ministering to one another and ministering to others out in the community in ways that we have never done so before and could never imagine that we would. It seems, as you read through all this, throughout the history of the church and through the entire story of our faith in the scriptures, it's in the wilderness places where God's people they've thrived and they've grown the most. So I say, come on, let's make this time count, shall we? Let's make the most of this. Now, for some of us, I bet you have been thinking for a while now, one of the days I'm going to actually develop a priority of prayer in my life, or one of the days I really want to read through the Bible. I'm going to set out on one of those Bible plans and read part of the Bible, book of the Bible a month, or I'm going to actually get one of those books that have been recommended to me related to a topic to do with faith, and one day I'm actually read through that. I say, let's not put it off any longer. Maybe today is that day. I'm talking about recommended books and not putting things off. Andrew's reminding me of a book that she read earlier on in the year, Atomic Habits.
Yeah, like Rob said, this is the book, Atomic Habits, and it's not very often that, I don't know about you, but you come across a book that you want to read again and again. And initially, we've got this actually on Audible. We done that because of John Wright, our national director of the Vineyard movement, had actually recommended it to us to read. And so we downloaded it there and then, and I listened to it, and I was so taken aback by the simplicity and the practicality of what James says in his book, that I just thought, my goodness, this is really good, that I've got to actually buy a copy of the book so that I can actually put notes in it. And he talks about changing small habits little by little every day. And he's saying, basically, it's a revolutionary system to get 1% better every day. And honestly, I mean, it really so appeals to me because of its practical list forming, habitual and things like that. So if you're that type of person, you're that way inclined, and it's something that you want to do, and certainly, although it is a secular book, and I know he's been used throughout many, many massive businesses who are using him and leaders throughout the whole of the world, you certainly can use his principles to change your spiritual life. And that is very much the kind of road that I'm going down. So again, definitely, I seriously cannot recommend this enough. It's a brilliant book.
Also, if I can recommend a couple of really great resources, the Bible Project, what we were the video related to the video. The Bible Project is a non-profit, crowd-funded project. So I'd encourage you to head on over to BibleProject.com. There you can find a whole stack of resources, video clips and studies and podcast lessons, a reading plan, and Bible classes and all sorts. So if you're kind of thinking about how can I begin to start to form some good practices, some good repetitive things to help me grow during this time, why don't you just head over to there and have a look at some of the resources that are on that website. Also, if you want to take your studies just to that next level, you're thinking, okay, that's great to get me started. I want to go a little bit further with my studies and or whatever. So another resource, another thing that I want to point you to, I want to invite you to sign up to Vineyard Institute, or VI. VI really is about theology, but theology for everyone. Now, what makes VI different to many learning institutions is it's way more than just information dissemination. It's way more than just growing academia. VI, it's about equipping for purpose. It's about equipping for mission and calling. We're all called to something. And VI is about us being effectively sort of trained to go from where we are right now to where God has designed us to be. And that's at all levels of kingdom ministry. That could be inside the church or outside of the church walls. So I'd encourage both of those resources. And I'm sure there are many, many more we can talk about. But so there we go. That's the beginning of our Book of Numbers session, if you like, on this teaching. Let's see how we can nurture faith during the wilderness time, shall we? See you soon.